Okay, we have our last session on the Priceless Pearl. How am I going to begin this last session? Well, I think it would be of interest to select something from the Priceless Pearl that is very relevant to today. Actually two involves, of course, the Guardian, and the present one, the Universal House of Justice. So beginning on page 259, Rahia Khanum relates the wish of the greatest holy leaf to lie in burial near her mother and brother. Shoghi Effendi wanted to make this possible. The remains had to be transferred from Akka to Haifa. Among the things Shoghi Effendi had to do was to order from Italy 2 more monuments based on the same pattern that was designed for the monument of the greatest holy leaf. Fortunately, those 2 new monuments arrived safely because there was a war going on at the time of their delivery. Then he learned that the covenant breakers were protesting against his action and carried their demands as family members of Baha'u'llah to the government. Shoghi Effendi had to deal with that. However, when you read of the Guardian's gathering with his own hands the meager remains of the wife and son of Baha'u'llah, the mother and brother of Abdu'l-Baha, you will probably be brought to tears. The second incident similar was the Guardian having to worry about the remains of Abdu'l-Baha as the superstructure was being built over the simple stone building that at the time was the Shrine of the Bab and the temporary burial resting place of Abdu'l-Baha. The exact dimensions of the chamber where the master is entombed are not known, and there was the possibility of the support pylons for the superstructure breaking into the chamber. Rahia Khanum writes of how Shoghi Effendi educated her that you couldn't just move Abdu'l-Baha's remains and store it somewhere for a few months and then bring them back. The respect for Abdu'l-Baha's remains would require that they be ceremoniously removed as a solemn and sacred occasion and returned with the same dignity and in the presence of notables. You can read the details of those 2 narratives that educates us as to the importance of reverence, including a lack of Baha'i notables, an interesting part of the story. Well, so much of Rahia Khanum's relating in the Priceless Pearl has the additional benefit of helping Baha'i institutions understand the divine guidance behind the methods of the Guardian in all that affects the faith of Baha'u'llah. How much more so the Universal House of Justice? Because very soon, the Universal House of Justice must decide on the ceremony of transferring the remains of Abdu'l-Baha from those temporary chambers on the slopes of Mount Carmel, which have been there for more than a century, and they'll be transferred to that beautiful shrine being erected as we meet in the vicinity of the Rizwan Gardens. Each reader of the Priceless Pearl deepens in knowledge and understanding as each one of us evolves spiritually and intellectually. Knowledge that I was relatively comfortable with became inadequate in appreciating the revelation of Baha'u'llah, particularly his world order. I'll give you one example how I didn't see what was in front of me. On my bookshelf, I've had for 60 years a book entitled Baha'i Administration. Now I know that it's not just a book title. It is the first step of a process that Shoghi Effendi started. The book itself contains excerpts from the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha and early letters from Shoghi Effendi, all connected to the world order of Baha'u'llah. If you flip through the pages of Baha'i Administration, what jumps out at you are bold headings in front of and top of the messages from Shoghi Effendi. These bold headings: National Assemblies, Annual Election of Assemblies, Annual Conventions, Duties of Elected Representatives, the New World Order, and this will surprise you, the foundation of the House of Justice. He sends a letter that we put above it, the foundation of the House of Justice. That letter was written in 1934, 40 years before this divine institution was established. Ali Nachavani, in Towards World Order, explains the chronology of this process begun by Shoghi Effendi. He says the first step is the Baha'i Administration, which the world order was at the time of that book. The second step, which we're in now, is the Baha'i Administrative Order. The next step, Ali Nachavani says, is Baha'u'llah's New World Order, signalizing the advent of the Golden Age. The fourth step is the Baha'i World Commonwealth, followed by the Most Great Peace, followed by the Promised New Civilization. So of those 6 steps that the faith must go through for the world order of Baha'u'llah, we're only on step 2. This is why we are told that Shoghi Effendi's work will affect the next several centuries. Just as we can't separate the Bab from Baha'u'llah, that they are ever connected in the entire dispensation, other parts of the cause are linked together. 2 cases. Shoghi Effendi often said that the administrative order was the child of the covenant. In the Priceless Pearl, Rahia Khanum relates the Will and Testament with the tablet of the divine plan. This is what she wrote. Whereas the charter of the Will and Testament of the Master operated throughout the world through the erection of those administrative institutions he had so clearly defined in it, and the charter of the divine plan was concerned with the spiritual conquest of the entire planet through the teachings of Baha'u'llah, and likewise had the globe itself as its theater of operations. I had mentioned this, and it's in this note. Shoghi Effendi was criticized for not implementing the divine plan. After all, Abdu'l-Baha revealed it in 1916. The Guardian said he had to have something to work with. A system had to be built as the foundation of support for the believers who would arise and scatter over the face of the planet, giving Baha'u'llah's message to mankind. Baha'u'llah provided the system. Shoghi Effendi began its erection, and the House of Justice continues it. The Priceless Pearl has us watching in the reading, the building of those administrative institutions, strong enough, even in their embryonic stages, to support the plans that the Guardian would put into operation. 1937 to 44 was the first of those plans. 20 years plus after Abdu'l-Baha revealed the divine plan. To put this period in a personal setting, Shoghi Effendi was married in March of 1937. In April, he launched that first plan, but he didn't just send it to America and leave it there. Here's what Rahia Khanum tells us. Through a cable addressed to the 1937 convention while it was in session, this is the American convention, he called upon the delegates to prolong the convention in order to have time to consider the details of this plan, which they would have to formulate and launch. Friends, think of the time schedule. 1916, Abdu'l-Baha writes it. 1937 is when the Guardian gets the first plan and sends it to America. What topic could be more important for the delegates to consult on than the steps needed to put that process of the divine plan systematically in operation? She writes, it was the Guardian who had so laboriously erected this machinery with the help and willing and eager tools he found among the North American believers, who grasped his thought, obeyed his command, and hastened to put into action his instruction. Friends, just as you can flip through the pages of the mentioned Baha'i administration, I, in this past week, have been flipping through the pages of the Priceless Pearl. I found that on any given page, my eyes would find something worth adding to this paper, such as this, that fits into what was just discussed, and also what we learned in the study of the Kitabi Akdas. This is Rahia Khanum. After the master's passing, we went at the House of Justice the next day. It had to wait 42 years until a foundation to support it, tier on tier of local assemblies and national assemblies, was built on which it could firmly stand. We wanted the Akdas in English. Slowly, much of it was translated and given to us by Shoghi Effendi himself, as he repeatedly quoted from it. The few laws and ordinances and details not already given were to come later. They required very careful work, part of which he undertook himself near the end of his life. Most of us know that Shoghi Effendi was fond of statistics and maps. Rahia Khanum in The Priceless Pearl gives us pages and pages of numbers representing their growth after each of his plans. Increases in the centers of the faith, the institutions, the languages, the endowments, financial assets, tribes, races, cultures, translations. He shared everything with the believers. One simple sentence gives us an appreciation of Shoghi Effendi's thinking. The Guardian devoted particular attention, in addition to creating the structural basis of the administrative order and assuring the rapid spread of the faith, to ensuring that Baha'i literature be made available in different languages to the peoples of the world. Why not? in order for the Baha'is to give the message of Baha'u'llah, it had to be given in the languages of the listeners' ears. Like a general sending out his troops, Shoghi Effendi's strategy was sending the international pioneers to wider and wider fields of action. It was systematic. The first 7-year plan, 37 to 1944, was for the United States, Canada, and more than anything else, Latin America. The second 7-year plan, 1946 to 1953, was Europe. A good part of that continent was getting over World War II. And then the 10-year crusade, 1953 to 63, the field of action was the world. He said in one publication, mostly countries that had little connection with either Christianity or Islam. It was during that last plan that the believers lost their general, their much-loved guardian. I can't help thinking that had they been aware of his day-to-day sacrificial services for the faith, for the world, for them, that we're now reading in the Priceless Pearl, that they would have themselves arisen to even greater heights of service. But except for a few personal letters sharing his weariness and burdens, those thousands of messages were aimed at educating, guiding, and uplifting the believers. He left us with a firm foundation of the world order that Baha'u'llah suffered to bring humanity, and which the House of Justice continues to build upon. Let us leave this minute coverage of the world order with a quote from Florence Mayberry's biography, The Great Adventure. Herself a professional writer, she wrote of the Guardian. His words rapid, yet clear as crystal. The conditions and affairs of the world swept over one in a flood of insight and original vision, presenting a universal comprehension of the world in conjunction with its problems, along with a Jovian view of its torturous efforts to discover remedy for its relief, then pointing out the bright solution, the luminous hope guiding it forward. I call these next pages Part 2. I don't envision a theme for this second part, but hope that you might appreciate what has been selected to relate. For me, every sentence feeds my mind and my heart. And you may think that this is true because of being so blessed with the humble association with the author and widow of Shoghi Effendi, Amita Baha Rahia Khanum. And that may well be a factor, but also because I never knew the Guardian. The Priceless Pearl brought him to life for me. You know, friends, only 2 years divide my one first meeting with Amita Baha Rahia Khanum as a pilgrim in 1966, and regularly being in her presence while serving at the World Center beginning in 1968. But what a contrast those periods were for me personally. That first meeting, which I've shared before, was really personally embarrassing. For when the Western pilgrims met with her in the Mandar room of the Master's house, she talked about the critical needs of the faith and the importance of the believers to arise to those needs. She spoke at length to us on the subject, particularly of the American believers arising to do more. We 10 pilgrims at the time were all Americans. She herself was raised in North America. To those emphatic statements, little Marianne pops up and says, well, the American Baha'i should be told all of this. To which she replied, what do you think Shoghi Effendi was doing all those years? Well, Marianne wasn't thinking. Marianne didn't know. And my only excuse was I was a Baha'i of about 5 years, and I didn't know much at all. But I'm happy to report I've learned a lot since then. And in retrospect, the Priceless Pearl was the instrument that educated me in the work and writings of Shoghi Effendi. You remember in the last session, we said how Ali Nachivani answered the question in Akito, Italy, when he was asked, how could we love and appreciate Shoghi Effendi more? And Mr. Nachivani said, read the Priceless Pearl and read the Guardian's letters. One subject selected from the Priceless Pearl is the permanent closing of the Baha'i schools in Iran. These were the Tarbiyat school for boys and one for girls. They had existed for 36 years. They were founded during Abdu'l-Baha's time, and they were schools very close to his heart. But in 1934, the Iranian authorities decided to clamp down on the faith, one of many periods of persecution of the faith and the Persian believers. One action the authorities took was to insist that the schools remain open on the forthcoming commemoration of the Bab's martyrdom, even though they were the best schools in Persia. The National Assembly, of course, contacted the Guardian, who without hesitation said that they could not remain open on a Baha'i holy day. We know from our Zoom sessions of the Kitabi Akdas, Baha'u'llah's Book of Laws, that work is forbidden on 9 Baha'i holy days. How could he, as head of the faith of Baha'u'llah, ordain that those schools should stay open? They remain closed to this day. You will read in the Priceless Pearl other restrictions and even cruelties imposed on the believers in the cradle of the faith. Among Shoghi Effendi's responsibility was the care and development of the faith's properties, especially those associated with the central figures of the faith. One example was acquiring Mazareh, where Baha'u'llah first lived upon being permitted outside the walls of Akka. Page 290 relates how circumstances arose that found the Guardian appealing directly to Ben Gurion, explaining the historic importance of the mansion to the faith. In 1950, the Prime Minister himself arranged for the keys of Mazareh to be delivered to Shoghi Effendi after a lapse of almost 50 years, but only on a lease basis. In 1973, when I was there, the Universal House of Justice cabled all national assemblies who spread the happy news to the believers of the purchase of the mansion of Mazareh. 2 years later, 1975, the House of Justice announced the permanent ownership of the House of Abdullah Pasha in Akka. The Priceless Pearl tells us that it was a stone's throw from the military barracks where Baha'u'llah was imprisoned. This was Abdu'l-Baha's Akka home, the birthplace of Shoghi Effendi, and where the first Western pilgrims visited the Master. Among those early believers was Mary Ellis Bowes, who in marriage became May Maxwell, and later still the mother-in-law of Shoghi Effendi. Some of you have heard the story of the first dinner party that Rahia Khanum came to when I had that British mandate house on the Mediterranean. There were several funny things that happened, but during the meal, she lifted up the tablecloth and asked where I had gotten the table. I explained that it was in Ian Simple's office, but it wasn't being used for anything in particular. So I asked him if I could take it to my flat. Excuse me. So I asked him if I could take it to my flat and the fund wouldn't have to buy me a dining table. Rahia Khanum said that it was the table that Shoghi Effendi used when he had meals with the pilgrims. She didn't ask me to return it, but when I had to change flats, I did return it to her, and eventually she placed it in the reception area of the house of Abdullah Pasha. Naturally enough, the Priceless Pearl says much about Rahia Khanum's parents in association with the Guardian. Of course, May Ellis Bowles, and as May Maxwell, had a precious association with Abdul Baha, which continued with Shoghi Effendi. I'll only mention here how in 1940, at age 70, and in frail health, Mrs. Maxwell set off to pioneer to South America. She no sooner reached Buenos Aires when she had a heart attack and died. The Guardian, knowing how the daughter would be affected by the death of her beloved mother, conveyed the sad news, wrapping it in loving humor. Rahia Khanum wrote in The Priceless Pearl, his vivid depiction of her as she wandered around the Abha kingdom, making a thorough nuisance of herself because all she wanted to talk about was her beloved daughter on earth, all combined to lift me into a state of such happiness that many times I would find myself laughing with him over the things he seemed to be actually divining. I'd like to say more, as written by her longtime companion, Violette Nachavani, in her book, A Tribute to Amita Baha, Rahia Khanum. She expands on this narrative. Those of you who don't have the book will be particularly happy to hear this part of it. This is Violette Nachavani. The devastating news of May Maxwell's passing in Argentina was a terrible shock to Rahia Khanum. She often repeated the story of how she received the sad news from the Guardian. 4 cables had arrived that day, and she took them to Shoghi Effendi in his study. He opened each one and then looked up at Rahia Khanum with a mixture of shock, love, and compassion. She said the look frightened her, and she started backing away until she reached the wall. She said she wanted to sink into the wall, so deep was the fear engendered in her by that look. Shoghi Effendi went over to her, held her in his arms, and broke the news to her with great tenderness. He told her, "Now I will be your mother." Then he spoke of the high station of May Maxwell and the Abha kingdom, of her joy in at long last having reached her heart's desire, of her nearness to her beloved Lord and Master, Abdu'l-Baha. Then gently, in order to dispel her shaking grief, he began to talk to Amita-Baha in a lighter mood, to describe her mother's activities in the next world, where she was going, and what she was doing in that sublime company. She would have been ushered immediately into the presence of Baha'u'llah. Of course, he assured her. And no sooner had she come there than she naturally asked permission to tell him about her precious daughter. As she talked so much, Baha'u'llah had finally become tired and had passed her on to Abdu'l-Baha. Here again, she did nothing but talk about her beautiful daughter, until at length, exhausted, Abdu'l-Baha passed her on to the greatest holy leaf. And there she still is, said Shoghi Effendi, laughing. There she is, talking about her beloved daughter, stopping every passing member of the concourse with her opening lines. Do let me tell you about my daughter. By the time he reached this point in his narrative, Rahia Khanum was laughing through her tears. And so, with infinite compassion and patience, he comforted her. Volume 2 of the Maxwells of Montreal has a photo of the monument Shoghi Effendi commissioned to grace the graveside of May Maxwell. You will see what I found to be a collaboration of her unique loved ones. The monument was designed by her husband, William Sutherland Maxwell. The wings gracing the top were suggested by her daughter, Amita-Baha Rahia Khanum, and a chiseled tablet written and signed on the stone by her beloved guardian, Shoghi Effendi. Rahia Khanum writes in The Priceless Pearl, it was her death that really brought about the relationship between the guardian and Southern Maxwell, that raised him to the heights of service he was able to attain before he too passed away. And on another page, but such relationships were very rare in the guardian's life. One such, however, was with my father. It has often seemed to me that of the many undeserved blessings in my life, this was one of the greatest that God, in his infinite mercy, showered upon me, the great love between Shoghi Effendi and my father. This is something she used to mention to us regularly. Indeed, that love was so strong that when Mr. Maxwell died, Rahia Khanum had to console Shoghi Effendi, relating that it was like his father died instead of hers. One might deduce that the Maxwells provided Shoghi Effendi with a relationship that he could never have with his own Eastern relatives. You will read much about that special relationship and how Shoghi Effendi, concerned for her father-in-law after the death of May Maxwell, invited Sutherland to come to Haifa. Their, shall we say, professional architectural collaboration came to a head, particularly on one occasion. His daughter wrote, one day when he, Shoghi Effendi, came home from the Shrine Gardens, he asked me what I thought about such and such dimensions for a flight of stairs. What would that look like? I asked him why, when he had one of Canada's best architects living across the street in the Western Pilgrim House, he did not ask Daddy to work it out for him. I remember he looked at me in surprise, and asked if I thought he could. I assured him that to my father, it was child's play to design such a thing, and he could do it at once. Of course, the greatest collaboration between the two was the superstructure of the Shrine of the Bab. Later, Shoghi Effendi appointed Sutherland Maxwell a hand of the cause of God. Priceless Pearl goes into Shoghi Effendi's such appointments, especially in compliance of the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha, and also how he filled a vacancy when a hand died. Two of the hands thus appointed were raised to the position occupied by their fathers. Thus, the mantle of my father fell on my shoulders. Ali Muhammad Varga was appointed to succeed his father. Not long after George Townsend's death, the guardian appointed Agnes Alexander. Thus, the number of 19 was maintained by him until the third contingent of hands was nominated in his last great message at the midway point of the World Crusade. It was in Shoghi Effendi's message of the passing of Sutherland Maxwell and the appointment of his daughter as his replacement as a hand of the cause that he wrote of the word mantle. The mantle had been taken from the shoulders of the father and placed upon the shoulders of the daughter. Another subject some of you may know about is Shoghi Effendi was a humble person, but when it came to defending the faith or his station as head of the faith, he was a lion. One case, he accepted an invitation to a reception given by the district commissioner in honor of the high commissioner. She writes, on entering the room, the guardian found the high commissioner seated at the center and top of the room. The only chair near him that was vacant was the one on his right. Unhesitatingly, Shoghi Effendi advanced and seated himself in it. As this was the one reserved for the district commissioner, and he did not wish to request the guardian publicly to vacate it, another one was brought for that official. Shoghi Effendi knew well that on any similar occasion, this would not be permitted to happen, so he never again attended such a function. Of course, it was the guardian who appointed the International Baha'i Council, and those members were able to represent him at such functions. There's also a bit that Rahia Khanum writes of the guardian educating the believers on our association with governments, particular being obedient to governments no matter where we reside. And she writes, the Baha'is, as Shoghi Effendi said so aptly, belong to no political parties, but to God's party. They are the agents of his divine policy. The Priceless Pearl, under Rahia Khanum's creative pen, educates and inspires us as if we were in Shoghi Effendi's presence. Another area was his personal relationship with the believers, high and low. How respectful he would be to all strata of society, of all strata of humanity. He was overjoyed that Queen Marie of Romania declared her belief in Baha'u'llah. He not only corresponded with this first member of royalty to become a Baha'i, but others in the royal courts. We look at the inside of her declaration of faith in the priceless pearl. Disapproval from her caste, authoritative powers preventing her from coming to the Holy Land as a pilgrim and meeting with the guardian, their respect of each other's high positions. The House of Justice experienced this with the only reigning ruler who was a Baha'i, the Malietoa of Samoa. He was prevented several times from coming as a pilgrim and meeting with the House of Justice. When you read the section on Queen Marie, you also read of one of the outstanding teachers of the cause, Martha Root, who delivered the message of the faith of Baha'u'llah to the Queen, wisely keeping the guardian abreast of her meetings with the Queen. You can learn of this period in her life and all other services around the world in M.R. Garris's book, Martha Root, Lioness at the Threshold. And I also recommend my friend Della Marcus's publication, Queen Marie, Her Eternal Crown. Della was just visiting a few of us in Rio Rancho last month. She has lived many years in Romania and is living back there at present. Of Martha Root's passing, the priceless pearl reads, she had been on fire with pain during the last weeks of a tour of the Antipodes, and on her way back to America to assist in the prosecution of the first 7-year plan, she literally dropped in her tracks. Yielding up a life, the guardian said, might well be regarded as the fairest fruit, the formative age of the dispensation of Baha'u'llah had yet produced. An American woman. You will be moved by another outstanding maidservant of the cause, Keith Ramson Keeler, whom the guardian sent to Persia to negotiate the repeal of a law forbidding Baha'i literature to go through the postal system. At one point, she cabled Shoghi Effendi and said that her mission was a success, but the authorities reneged on their words, and the law has never been repealed. Keith's stay in Iran was lengthy, and she succumbed to a disease and is buried in Isfahan. In God Passes By, Shoghi Effendi wrote of fearless and brilliant Keith Ramson Keeler, the first American martyr. You can read in the section of Rahia Khadem's diary of the beloved servants of the cause, servants to Shoghi Effendi himself. One in particular was Ali Ashkar. Ali Ashkar went into the hospital at a particular difficult time in the guardian's life. Shoghi Effendi said, all I had left was you and your father and Ali Ashkar, and God takes Ali Ashkar. Shoghi Effendi told Rahia Khadem to tell Ali Ashkar when visiting that servant in the hospital that he had cabled the Persian friends about him, referring to him as a lion in the jungle of the love of God. She writes that there was the cutest little tickle of a smile when she told Ali Ashkar. Then he grasped the fact that such a cable meant that he was going to die. You have to read of the tender care Shoghi Effendi took in burying his friend and servant. Would that we could experience 1/10 of such attention. Rahia Khanum, on many occasions, would speak to us about Ali Asghar. She would relate that the guardian would return home so weary, his shoulders burdened with problems, and call for Ali Asghar. She said that it would break your heart to see the two of them sitting so close together while the guardian poured out his problems to this servant. And Rahia Khanum would emphasize he was a servant in the true sense of the word. The guardian loved him very much. She also spoke of a gardener whom Shoghi Effendi loved. When that servant died, Shoghi Effendi moved the little shed he used near the shrine of the Bab 4 times. He couldn't bring himself to destroy it as the gardens grew and developed. Surely Shoghi Effendi had the tenderest of hearts. I can testify that so did his soulmate, Amatu Baha Rahia Khanum. I'm going to deviate from the rest of my few notes because I'd like to talk about Rahia Khanum's love and consideration of pioneers. When she came back from Africa, and a few of us were having dinner with her, she gave me a menu. She liked the design on the menu. Marianne, I want you to paint me some ideas for a book cover. And I want this design on the book cover, which was a series of waves that was on a menu for a restaurant. But the waves are all outlined in black, and I don't want you to use any black. So she gave me a set of paints and some paint brushes and a glass of water and a bunch of pieces of paper and this menu, and put me in a room in the master's house called the gate. What's the gate at Badger? Millie Collins. It's known as the Millie Collins room. So Marianne, being obedient, went to this room and designed these waves on this paper, being totally obedient. Do not use black. Well, I'm not as professional an artist as Rahia Khanum, and I knew they were bad. They were bad. So I had about a dozen of them and went out of the Millie Collins room and met Rahia Khanum and the others and presented her with these designs. And I could tell from her face that she thought they were as bad as I thought they were. So she took the designs and she took the menu and she took the paint and the paint brushes and went to her private quarters and worked on it herself. And of course, this is the design. And guess what color is in it? Black. The reason I mention this book is it's because it's the love of the pioneers that made her write this book. She travels all over the world. She meets with the pilgrims. And so she wanted to give the pilgrims something that would help them when they were away from home. The first thing she did was put the greatest name and a picture of Abdu'l-Baha and write a little note at the beginning telling them how they can duplicate it and give it to their friends and put it on their walls, that they would have the picture of Abdu'l-Baha and the greatest name. Just listen to the chapters. The chapters are where to pioneer. What do you do when you get there? Do you have depression? Pioneers and the administration, problems with children, husbands, boredom, contributions, visas. She even teaches them how to build a mandar room, how to build a mandar that can be used for seating as many seekers as possible, and you could even sleep on it. She loved the pioneers so much that she wrote this book to help them. It really even helps those of us who are not pioneering internationally as to how to serve the faith in many circumstances. One of my jobs at the World Center that I've spoke of before was very minor, but important. The House of Justice said that I could give permission for 3-day visits if the permission was requested through a National Assembly. If it was requested by individuals, I would have to see if they were Baha'is in good standing. But anyway, because of this one little job that was infrequently needed, I would produce a little piece of paper listing all the Baha'is with permission to come on a 3-day visitor. Therefore, I knew when these visitors were international pioneers, and I would let Rahia Khanum know when the 3-day visitors were international pioneers. And she would make a point of inviting them to the master's house for dinner. And occasionally she would invite me to join them. And it was such a thrill to see these visitors, mostly men and women who were married, sitting in the presence of Shoghi Effendi's widow, intimately having dinner and a conversation with Amata Baha Rahia Khanum. They never expected this, but this was the love and respect that she gave international pioneers. Okay, I'm wrapping this up. Really, I am. There are so many subjects that we haven't really touched upon. One important one is Shoghi Effendi's relationship with the American Baha'i community. I'm going to leave it to you to immerse yourself in the ocean of that subject as Rahia Khanum narrates it in The Priceless Pearl. America's role in the world order of Baha'u'llah and the peoples of the world need to be understood. The greatest impact on the American Baha'i community was and is Abdu'l-Baha's divine plan. Shoghi Effendi called it the weightiest spiritual enterprise launched in recorded history, not in religious recorded history, in all recorded history. In The Priceless Pearl, Rahia Khanum writes, if Shoghi Effendi was the general, undoubtedly his chief of staff was the American Assembly. It got its orders direct from him, and the rapport was intimate and complete. But he never forgot that the glory of an army is its soldiers, the rank and file, as he forthrightly called them. He never ceased to appeal to them, to inspire them, to love them, and to inform them that every North American believer shared a direct responsibility for the success of the plan. I'd like to truly end this last session with the prophecies in the tablet of the Holy Mariner that speak to our second and obvious theme of The Priceless Pearl. the suffering of Shoghi Effendi. This is from Ali Nachavani in Towards World Order. In this tablet, 3 figures prominently emerge. 1, the holy mariner, namely Baha'u'llah himself. 2, the maid of heaven who flooded with the light of her countenance the heaven and the earth, namely Abdu'l-Baha. And 3, one of the handmaidens of the maid of heaven, who is also described as the favored damsel who perfumed all things in the lands of holiness and grandeur, namely Shoghi Effendi. Thank you.
When Shoghi Effendi said that the tests that the people in the West would experience would be mental tests, what is the take-home message of that for us?
Well, my understanding is that unlike the sacrifice of blood that the Persians had to give for the advancement of the faith, the American Western Baha'is would not have to suffer that sort of martyrdom unless it would occur in physical problems within countries. In other words, if we lived in a country that was at war, every morning I pray for the Baha'is in the Ukraine and Russia. So we may suffer physically like everybody else, but we're not going to be asked to shed our blood by the thousands, such as our Persian believers. So because the world, as I said in one of the quotes from Florence Mayberry, that the Guardian could relate history according to the problems in the world, and the world is seeking solutions that are only in the revelation of Baha'u'llah. So the world is going to suffer because they have missed the call of Baha'u'llah. This is my understanding. So our tests will be mental. Florence Mayberry, when she was a pilgrim, she took copious notes. And we're not supposed to give a lot of credence to pilgrims' notes. The Guardian warned us, this was not anything authentic, but Florence Mayberry told me herself that when she returned from pilgrimage and wrote her notes, she sent them to Rahia Khanum, who wrote her back and said, yes, that her notes reflected what she heard from Shoghi Effendi. One of the things I remember Florence saying was the Guardian, she asked the Guardian, should she put her money in a bank? And Shoghi Effendi said, anywhere but in America. Now, I have no clue how that is going to manifest itself in the world. There's going to be a major financial crisis that will affect the world, I'm sure, because as the House of Justice says in the Promise of World Peace, we have a materialistic civilization. God didn't create us to be materialistic with consumerism and capitalism. You can have both of those elements, but that's not the main thrust of our existence. So it's all got to be changed. With change comes suffering. Shoghi Effendi said, I'm not in the prophetic business. I look at what is happening in the world and I deduce which direction we're going. House of Justice says the same thing. I don't know if that helps you.
I was wondering whether he was referring to the fact that in the West we can be very individualistic and that we need to really be mindful of our relationships and our tendencies. You know, we're very self-opinionated, we can be arrogant. Do you think he was referring to that?
Well, you know, he translated the writings, which explain that we've been created in the image of God. Those qualities that you just mentioned are the opposite. I don't know about Australia where you are, but we use the word entitlement with American behavior. You know, we don't want to suffer. We want the government to take care of us, and we have prejudices. We're now armed to the teeth. It could be unsafe to go to a movie in America nowadays. So if you aren't going into the direction that Baha'u'llah brought us revelation for, then you're going in the opposite direction, which can only bring you suffering.
Mm.
I could write a book about it.
Well, I wish you would.
I'm sure there are books out there about it.
Mm.
Dennis or Patty, do you have your hand up?
Yes. One of the things I wanted to say, and maybe you have something to speak to this, is Rahia Khanum's humility, in that she shared only I can think of an example of, as some of her misconceptions about the faith and the administration. And she thought that it would be very much like American democracy. And the Guardian, I don't remember exactly what he said to her, but he said, no, that's not the case. There would be elements of that. And we see with the elements of democracy that all our bodies now are, well, the executive bodies are all elected. And I just thought I just really admired that, you know, that her humility, to make a point that she would show us something that she misunderstood, which is probably a misunderstanding a lot of us, particularly those of us who are North Americans, particularly United States, would think, you know, that's the case. And so, you know, I told you one time, and you encouraged me, and I never did write the letter to Rahia Khanum to just thank her. I just felt like that book was such a blessing. And one of the things I love is the stories of, you know, we have of Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha. And those stories personalize in a way that nothing else does. You know, the stories of Baha'u'llah and the candy, you know, don't hide it before the master gives it away. You know, the story she talks about her interactions with the Guardian. And it just, for me, helps, and I'm sure that's true for a lot of folks, just strengthens that feeling of love and connection to the Guardian, the Abdul Baha, you know, all of everybody. I'm going to just wear myself out listening and trying to remember things, but I don't know if you had any thoughts on that kind of thing.
I know, you know, when I talk about her having such a loving heart, one of the things she said was, if I'm anything, I'm loyal to my friends. And I can remember thinking, yes, but how did we become close enough to be called your friends? Mm-hmm. She took, Violette and Rahia Khanum took me to Jaffa when I had that Mediterranean flat. And they let me look at the antique furniture that was being sold in this bazaar in Jaffa. And Violette would do the negotiating because they were Persian Jews who owned it. that she would take this interest in seeing that my house had a couch or a bed, or Rahia Khanum telling me you've got Shoghi Effendi's dining table. She bought, for example, she came back with 10 clay cups. They were brown on the outside and green, shiny on the inside. Israel is noted for their pottery, and she brought me 10 of these cups, and she said, "You owe me 10 pounds, Marianne." But she knew I didn't have any dishes, so she got me these cups because she saw it. I have a pizza cutter in my drawer in the kitchen. She bought me a pizza cutter. When I had dinner at my second house on the top floor of this 4-story building, she was sitting at the dining table, and Violette and Allie and Nell and Ethel Ravel were around the table, and I needed to fill up the water glasses. So I'd take a glass and I'd turn my back and fill it up and then put the glass on the table. And she's talking to everybody. And I pick up the next glass and I turn my back and I fill it up. And finally she said, "Marianne, what are you doing?" I said, "I don't have a water pitcher. I have a coffee tin." And I'm filling up the water glasses with this coffee. The next day, I had a water pitcher from her. It wasn't an expensive one. It was just a little clear plastic water pitcher. But this is what she does. And not just to people around her. When she sees a need, she fills it. Like writing this for pioneers. Her mind is always in service, whether she's serving Shoghi Effendi or whether she's serving a little pioneer who needs her spirit raised. I repeat, whenever I talk about Rahia Khanum, the first thing I say is she's the most generous person I've ever met. She said one time, "Nobody ever passed my mother's path without being the better for it." I say the same thing of the daughter. Good evening, David.
Good morning, Marianne,
Oh, it's morning in your land.
in Australia. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you get
Yeah.
over to New Zealand?
Not recently.
One of the original members of the Universal House of Justice married one of the young men who came to work for a year or two, and they are living in New Zealand because he's a New Zealander. Jonathan Risworth married Nancy Gibson, and that was back in the 82.
Well, I was over there about that time, but I wasn't a Baha'i then, so it wasn't on my radar. And I haven't been back since.
Oh, there's my dear friend Nell.
Yeah, that's Simin Naragi, Nell, and then of course me. Yeah, so Simin introduced me to Nell, and she was just lovely, I remember.
Oh, Nell's an institution.
Yeah. Yeah.
She just broke her femur falling down. So the House of Justice is taking very good care of her.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I wonder if I can zoom it just to see her. Hang on.
Is that you on the right, Marianne?
No, that's just my friend Nell that I speak so often about.
Yeah, this one.
That she became Rahia Khanum's secretary.
Mhm.
Is that you, Neda?
I'm over here with the glasses on the top.
Wow.
Yeah, that's me. And then this
When
is
was-
Simin Naragi. This is in Haifa. This
When
is
was
the bicentenary.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I got the impression, Marianne, when you talk about Ruhia Khanum, that she was a very practical, grounded, no nonsense sort of a person. Is that right?
She was, according to the Maxwells of Montreal, Abdu'l-Baha told her mother that she should raise her as a Baha'i. So she, if you read the book, you will see that her training from May Maxwell was totally different than the training one would get whose parents are Baha'i. Abdu'l-Baha told May Maxwell that she should be a free spirit. I have been offended personally on her behalf when some Baha'is think that she was left to be free and easy and do whatever she wants. This is totally false. She was very disciplined and, of course, loving, and from day one learned to serve the cause because her mother had this love of the faith and love of Abdu'l-Baha. She did everything according to the best method possible. To every precious principle in the faith, she would follow to the letter of the law. But she didn't, she didn't flagrantly let it be known that she was like a stick in the mud. She was definitely not a stick in the mud. She was very generous and loving, and you can't say enough about her unique personality. Does that help you?
Yeah, it does. I've read one, she wrote a letter to a young man, I think, and it was about Baha'i administration, and it was a revelation really for me to read it. And I really warmed towards her because I felt she, in some ways, was fearless and a free spirit in her own way, and someone that wasn't afraid to say what she thought needed to be said, you know.
We used to think, because, and I'll mention something about it in this last session, without her knowing we did it, on occasion we would refer to her as being a Jewish mama, because she would say things to the American Baha'is that at this stage in our development, the House of Justice is not going to be that blunt with us. But as a fellow American, as a fellow servant of wanting to serve the cause and teach the faith, she could be very strong. I told you how she talked to the youth in the 1970s convention she went to in Wilmette. She talked to them like a mother. This is how you should behave. And they loved it. And sometimes she would accidentally hurt someone. And I learned from her, when I accidentally hurt someone, how to make amends. Because when she was aware that she might have hurt a heart, she turned around and did something so precious. She put something in their hands that was from her hands, that they would not have had if she hadn't realized that she might have hurt another heart. So
yeah, very refreshing. I got the impression that she wasn't politically correct at all, that she just said what she felt needed to be said.
Yeah, not true. She did everything politically correct. She was raised by her mother, who was raised by Abdu'l-Baha. Then she was raised even before. If you read in the Maxwells of Montreal, you will read where Shoghi Effendi was actually in correspondence with May Maxwell on the raising of little Mary. So no, she wasn't that kind of free spirit. She was a good, and she would say, I was a good daughter.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when my mother bought me a dress, well, I deserved that dress because I was a good daughter. Life was not easy for Rahia Khanum as little Mary Maxwell. When Sutherland Maxwell got engaged to May Ellis Bowles, her relatives told him, you're marrying an invalid. And he said, yes, I know that. Her mother was very ill. And there were strict rules on how the household should be quietly raised because of her mother's illness. And little Mary had to obey parental laws. And if she slipped, like any parent, she might be punished. So she was not the free spirit that Americans refer to, carefree and do whatever you want. No, she followed every rule.
Yeah.
The Maxwells of Montreal.
Yeah, thank you.
She's unique.
Yeah.
When she got ill in Japan and Taiwan, she went to Australia to recuperate. The Baha'is didn't know she was there. Only the World Center and the National Assembly knew that she was there because she had a chest condition that was critical. And she went to Australia to recover from that.
Yeah. Wow.
While she was there, she and Violette saw the movie Oh God with George Burns. And she wrote us saying, you got to go see the movie. It's really good.
Yeah. So
Good evening, ladies. I see we have some Kathy and Joyce.
Has anyone written a biography of her?
On Rahia Khanum?
Yeah.
Well, there's the Priceless Pearl, which is all about her.
Right.
As well as The Guardian. And then there's the Maxwells of Montreal, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And hopefully the future historians will come up with Volume 3. We haven't heard the last of her life.
Yeah, thank you.